Hi everyone, thanks for joining me again. Our text for today is Romans 11 verse 1 through to verse 10. Now in verse 1, Paul asks a very important question. The question has to do with whether God's response to Israel's stubbornness and disobedience, its contrariness, 10 verse 21, whether God's response to that is for him to reject Israel completely. There would have been those in Paul's day who felt that the success of the gospel amongst the Gentiles and the large-scale refusal of the gospel amongst Jewish people would have meant that God had, as it were, turned his back on Israel once and for all and handed his kingdom over to the Gentiles. Paul's answer is very strong. By no means, he says. In fact, he feels so strongly about this that we get the answer twice in 2 verses. Has God rejected his people whom he foreknew? Answer, no. By no means. And again, verse 2, God has not rejected his people whom he foreknew. And between these two strong statements that God has not rejected his people, Paul gives personal proof of the fact. For there in the first century is Paul, an Israelite and a descendant of Abraham, a member of the tribe of Benjamin. You don't get more Israelite than that. And so Paul points to himself as an example of the fact that although in Jesus' day and in the day of the apostles as the gospel was spreading across the Roman Empire, although many Jews turned their backs on the message, nevertheless, from the beginning, from the coming of Jesus, God has not actually rejected Israel completely. It's not as if the gospel is for Gentiles only and not for Jews also. In fact, as we've seen before, throughout Paul's writing in this letter, his standard statement is first for the Jew and then for the Gentile, but not either or. So God has not rejected his people. Paul is an example of that. And Paul then goes to the story of Elijah. Israel, the northern kingdom in the days of Elijah, had largely turned their backs on God. It was a dark time in the northern kingdom's history. The king, of course, Ahab and Jezebel, the prophets of Baal, and Elijah the prophet felt so burdened that he returned to Horeb, where the covenant had been given, and there he appealed to God to start again with himself. I alone am left, Lord. They've destroyed, they've killed your prophets, they've demolished your altars. I alone am left, and they seek my life also. Very famous story. But God's answer to Elijah is that though appearances are that Israel has turned its back on him, in fact, he sovereignly has kept for himself 7,000 who have not bowed the knee to Baal. Now, I don't think this was a literal 7,000. We don't actually know what the number was. The number here, 7,000, is a symbolic number. 7, of course, is the number of God and his purposes. The book of Revelation, you remember, often uses 7 for the things of God, 6 for the things of men. And 7,000 is that image of fullness or of completion. So what is God saying to Elijah? He's basically saying that in those days, in Elijah's day, he had kept a remnant of his elect, the full number of his elect for himself, even though the northern kingdom had by and large turned its back on God. And now, says Paul, so too at the present time, that is in Paul's day, not our day, but Paul's day, there is a remnant chosen by grace. Again, this theme of grace and of God's electing love comes through very strongly. And again in verse 6, Paul reminds us that the fact that it is by grace means that it is not on the basis of works. For if it was on the basis of works, law-keeping or whatever, then grace would not be grace. So, has God rejected his people, Israel? Absolutely not, says Paul. I am an Israelite and a Christian. In the days of Elijah, God had a remnant. In my own day, says Paul, God has a remnant based on his choice, on his electing grace. So how do we explain Jewish unbelief in Jesus' day and Paul's day? Well, verse 7 gives us the answer. What then? Israel, by and large, the nation, failed to obtain what it was seeking. Remember, they were seeking righteousness, we saw in chapter 9 and chapter 10, but pursuing righteousness not by faith, which is what they should have done, but as if it was by works. So having set about pursuing God's righteousness by works, the net result is that Israel failed to obtain the righteousness, and in fact, as we saw, missed out on their own law. But was that true that the whole nation missed out? Well, remember, Paul himself is a Christian. And so Paul numbers himself amongst God's elect within Israel and says this in verse 7, the elect obtained it, but the rest were hardened. And he goes back now to the book of Isaiah chapter 29 and verse 10, where God, quoting really the words that were spoken in Isaiah chapter 6, they have eyes but do not see, ears but do not hear. That was the state of Israel in Isaiah's day. Now we discover that God has handed them over to their own blindness and closed their ears down to this very day. Quoting Isaiah, God gave them a spirit of stupor, eyes that do not see, ears that do not hear, down to this very day. By the way, the Isaiah 29 passage from which Paul quotes here is the same passage that Jesus quoted speaking to the Pharisees of his day when he spoke about the fact that they honored him with their lips, but that their hearts were far from him. So Paul and Jesus are completely in sync in terms of the application of Isaiah's words to the Israel of their own day. Israel remained in Paul's day, in Jesus' day, under this judgment because of their rejection of the gospel, their stubbornness, their stupor. Like Pharaoh, because they had hardened their hearts, God gave them over to hardness of heart. David is then quoted in verse 9 through to verse 10, and it's quoted from Psalm 66, verse 22 and 23. And it's again David speaking about those who are his enemies. He is the Messiah. He's God's chosen one. God's purposes are working their way out through David. But there were many in Israel, of course, who rejected God's purposes, Saul among them, who turned their backs on God's Messiah, David, and who chose to have a king like the nations. Like they wanted to be like the nations. We learn that from the book of Samuel, and they wanted a king like the nations. And so when God's Messiah comes, rather than choosing to follow God's Messiah, David in this case, they choose to go their own way, or their own kings. They follow their own leaders. And so what David says of his enemies in his day, Paul applies to Israel in Paul's day. Jesus, the Messiah, has now come, but Israel, by and large, have rejected their king. And so, as David says in Psalm 69, it may be so that their table become a snare and a trap, a stumbling block and a retribution for them. If you reject God's purposes and plans in his Messiah, you actually end up getting what you deserve. That's what David is saying. And their eyes being darkened so that they cannot see, and their backs being bent forever. It's the image of remaining in bondage or slavery. So if one turns one's back on God's King, Messiah, Jesus, what ends up happening? For all your religious privilege, and Israel certainly had privileges, Paul has spoken about those privileges throughout this section. For all one's religious privileges, if you turn your back on God's King, if we go our own way, if we reject God's revelation of the gospel in his Son because we find it weakness, which is what the Jews did, or foolishness, which is what the Greeks did, if we turn our backs on God's Messiah, the net result is that there is a handing over to darkness and blindness, except for God's grace. Now, of course, Paul is speaking about Israel in his day, but can you see that the principle applies much more generally? The principle applies to all who, having heard the gospel and having had the gospel preached and having had the signs of Jesus, his works put before them through the proclamation of the gospel, choose to go on rejecting him. And yet, all is not lost because God's electing purposes ensure that there will be people in his kingdom. And if that's true for Gentiles as a whole, it is certainly true for his ancient people Israel, whom he foreknew. So in verse 11 following, which we're going to look at tomorrow, Paul then goes on to explain how Jewish unbelief in his day leads to salvation for the Gentiles, and yet how salvation for the Gentiles will in its own turn lead to jealousy amongst his people and the conversion of many with Jewish background. And that's a great and a wonderfully encouraging prospect, says Paul, for the gospel to grow not only among Gentiles, but amongst Jews also. And that certainly was his experience as he traveled around the ancient world preaching the gospel in synagogue and in the marketplace. But that's for tomorrow. For today, then, the big lesson and the big point to take home is that for Paul, writing in his day, he was absolutely convinced that Israel had not been rejected, despite the privilege that the Gentiles were getting, despite the fact that the majority of Christians in his day were Gentiles. Nevertheless, God was not yet done with Israel. And that gave Paul great hope and confidence to keep preaching the gospel, not to Gentiles only, but to Jews also. Thank you for joining me. I hope you're finding Romans 9, 10, and 11 challenging passages, but also I hope you're finding our explanation helpful and that the lights are going on for you as you think about these passages, which are so often just ignored and not really studied at all.